Parks Country Day Camp was founded in 1951 and operated in Chanhassen through 1966. The camp was located on 166 acres of farmland east of Galpin Boulevard and west of Lakes Lucy and Ann. This overhead photo was taken during one of the camp's early years. 100 years previous to the founding, a land survey initiated with the purpose of memorializing the original vegetation in the Minnesota Territory. The land that eventually provided summer recreation to hundreds of boys and girls was originally a maple basswood forest. The Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota tribes ceded vast swaths of what became Minnesota to the United States. The land that encompasses all of Carver County was included in the land transfer as part of the 1851 Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. Originally, many of the outlying counties were much bigger than they are now, after many new counties were created. Carver County was always its current size. Interestingly, Carver City, along with Excelsior, Shakopee, and Hoxton, were the towns near here that were deemed important enough to place on the early map. Who knows what became of Hoxton? An early hand-drawn map from 1874 shows Chanhassen with the names of the early farm owners. You will note that Lotus Lake was originally called Long Lake. Lucy and Ann were called Lucy Lake and Ann Lake at the time, and Lake Riley was named Bradford Lake. Farms in and near the area that became the Parks Camp were owned by H.M. Lyman and C. Ripple. In this close-up of the 1874 map, you can see the location of what appears to be a church. The St. Hubert's building next to the old village hall, where we are now, was not built until 1887. The 1880 Chanhassen Township map shows a few new landowners, including George and Susanna Zanger and Peter Kerber, abutting Lakes Lucy and Ann. The topography of the area, particularly the shape of Lake Lucy, has changed somewhat across the decades. I have to say that historically, Lake Lucy's shore configuration is rather unstable. The two lakes are in the center of this 1937 aerial photograph. Note that Chanhassen was largely farmland at that time. If you overlay Chanhassen's 2022 streets on top of the 1937 depiction, it is easy to see how much development has taken place. During the 2 decades prior to the founding of Parks Country Day Camp, the population of Chanhassen, divided at that time between the village, today's core, and the township, increased by only 30%, while Chaska, home of the brickmaking industry, essentially doubled. Excelsior came close to tripling during that period. As a 7-year-old growing up in southwest Minneapolis, I had access to many after-school, weekend, and summer opportunities. I'd waded and dog paddled in Lake Harriet, played softball on the empty lot up the block from us, and skated at Pershing Park in the winter. But I had never experienced the vastness of recreation that I encountered when a school bus transported me from the city to a faraway place called Chanhassen in June of 1956. My parents did not brief me about this journey that began with a 45-minute ride. The bus traveled down 50th Street to Highway 100, went west on Highway 7, past the new Knollwood Plaza Shopping Center, drove tangent to the also new Minnetonka High School, did not stop for treats at Smack Drive-In, and finally turned left on Galpin Boulevard. Excelsior, with a population of over 4,000 between township and village, was the commercial hub for residents of Chanhassen and the small Lake Minnetonka villages. The amusement park drew thousands of visitors every summer. Pete and Betty Parks had a dream to create their own summer day camp for suburban and city kids of the Twin Cities. Residents of Deep Haven, they were both teachers, Pete at Blake School in Hopkins and Betty at Hopkins Junior High. Pete's summer occupation was as riding instructor for Camps Lincoln and Lake Hubert up near Nisswa. In 1950, they owned a 2-story house in the Vine Hill area of Deep Haven. It was a short drive from Deep Haven along Highway 7 and then Gulpin Boulevard to their new farm. In 2022, I was able to find the Parks children, then in their 80s, after I researched the 1950 U.S. Census data that was released on April 1st of that year. Through internet resources and an old-fashioned typed letter to one of the grandchildren, I was able to meet with the Parks' daughter, Kay, who lives in White Bear Lake. She provided me with all of the photos and letters used for this presentation. Pete, Betty, and children Richard, Kay, and Peggy could ride horses at their Deep Haven residence. The family recruited campers who sought a lower-cost, day-only experience that did not require travel up north for an extended absence from home. Providing an experience of farm life and recreational skills could be taught if they found enough acreage. Pete and Betty found 166 acres that lay east of Galpin and reached the shores of both Lake Lucy and Lake Ann. They somehow made the financing work, probably with the help of their Iowa parents. In January of 1951, they officially signed up to become farmland owners and thereby brought themselves several months of work before the camp could possibly open. This overhead shows the campgrounds a few years later with a large expanse of open space for activities, a wooded area for exploring on foot or horseback, and direct access both to Lake Lucy and Lake Ann. The existing farmhouse was not large enough for camp use, so they put it on beams, moved it out of the way, prepared the site via excavation, placed it on that new foundation, and then significantly expanded the structure so that, among other possibilities, a lunch area could fit at least 60 campers at a time. One risk that the family needed to consider while developing the camp was that the United States, and Minnesota in particular, were in the midst of a polio epidemic. By 1952, Minnesota was second in the nation behind Texas with 4,131 cases and 220 deaths. Many parents would not send their children to be in close proximity to strangers at places like the state fair or the circus. This factor could make recruiting campers difficult. This photo shows an educational event about polio that took place in Waconia at the time. Pete and Betty signed the purchase agreement on January 2nd, 1951. 2 months of planning would dominate their time away from teaching, so that real work could commence directly after the closing, scheduled for March 5th. They would only have 3 months after that to complete the land and building improvements in order to accept campers in June. Winter life in Chanhassen certainly provided challenges. They lived in a trailer for a spell, while the main house expansion was undertaken. Betty wrote frequently to her parents in Iowa.
Dearest folks, since everyone is always talking about the weather, I'll begin by saying it was 18 below zero again this morning. As we make plans for the farm, we are trying to remember that we live where it can be cold 8 months out of the year. I was out all Monday afternoon in the interest of March of Dimes. It was between 20 and 30 below. One advantage, no one has the nerve to turn you down. Home nursing was called off because of the difficulty in heating the village hall. Something was frozen in the basement as the pump couldn't get started. I carried down tea kettles of boiling water and poured on the pipes to the storage tank, and by 1 o'clock had saved a plumber's bill.
Remember that both Betty and Pete were simultaneously teaching full-time, commuting to Hopkins, and raising 3 children.
Monday, March 5th, 1951. Dearest folks, so Saturday we made our way back to Chaska in spite of Friday's storm. Many places along the road were open for one-way traffic, and we weren't sure they would be open by the time we got through with our business.
They purchased a 1946 Jeep with a snowplow attachment.
On Sunday, a man paid Pete $2 to get him out of a drift on the highway. The night before, Pete had shoveled out the oil station just being a good fellow, and so when he went for gas Sunday, the man wouldn't take any money.
They could not start excavating for the house renovation and camp buildings until the snow was gone. And what was Betty doing that Saturday afternoon? She was making her way to Excelsior to pick up penicillin for her neighbor who suffered from polio. Work began in earnest once spring emerged. The riding ring, where novice instruction would take place, was number 1 on the agenda. The camp opened with a partial schedule during the summer of 1951. The full comprehensive program commenced in 1952. A common destination for riders who were ready to escape the corral was the path down to Lake Lucy and Lake Ann. Parks Camp was one of the first summer day camps for both boys and girls together. The Minneapolis Morning Tribune caught wind of the new opportunity for Twin Cities children. Reporter Jane Thomas penned a feature story for the Sunday, July 26, 1952 edition. While horseback riding was a key program that made the Parks Country Day Camp a breakthrough facility for Minneapolis and suburban children, a wide variety of other activities were also prominent. Because the camp was tangent to 2 lakes, open water swimming became a daily activity. Lake Lucy may not have been the best early choice, because leeches would attach themselves to the young swimmers. During the camp's initial years, Pete and Betty created a sand beach and constructed a swimming dock on Lake Lucy. One of the topological features of Lucy was a floating island. Unfortunately, during one summer, the floating island smashed into the dock and destroyed it, necessitating the relocation of the Parks Camp swimming program to Lake Ann, a better choice anyway. Pete was ahead of his time in requiring all campers to learn life-saving techniques, including resuscitation. The most memorable recreational activity at the Parks Camp was the series of maze-like tunnels built out of bales of hay in the barn. Campers spent time crawling through the tunnels, encountering their campmates, and trying to find both the window that looked out onto the lower level of the barn and, of course, the egress point. Nowadays, we call such activities agro-entertainment. Arts and crafts projects were available every day, but came to the forefront when it rained. Lanyards, figurines, and copper designs, which campers would pound out and oxidize, were the most common. Hot meals were served every day in the big lunchroom. Before and after the campers ate, the counselors taught them a wide variety of traditional camp songs. Archery, rope swings, trampoline jumping, volleyball, and hay wagon rides rounded out the recreational offerings for which photos are extant. In addition to summer opportunities, the parks offered recreational activities during autumn Saturdays, even though preparations for winter might interfere, sometimes suddenly. Betty's letters to her folks in Iowa provided great insight into their 1950s Chanhassen farm life beyond running the camp. She wrote the following observations.
November 7th. Dearest folks, tomorrow's the last of the fall Saturday afternoon day camps. We have been so lucky on the weather. If the weather doesn't turn, we might go a couple more Saturdays and try to make up little we lost on our corn. We had figured 200 bushels, but the picker estimated it about 125. They tell us it is wet and the peat soil lacks the proper fertilizer.
This aerial photograph from 1957 shows the camp area as well as the farms that continue to operate apace nearby. You can see the riding ring in the cleared out area where the camp operated. The last of those working grain farms are probably the Dagler Farm on Lyman and Audubon, now known for its form of agro-entertainment, and the Gora land just to the west of Lake Ann. Today, the landscape has changed dramatically after decades of housing development. Nevertheless, much of the park's farm has been acquired by the city of Chanhassen for creating and expanding Lake Ann Park. Pete and Betty ceased camp operations in 1966 and sold their land in 1971. During the 1980s and into the 21st century, it was owned by Prince Rogers Nelson. The city managed to negotiate with later owners to gain valuable park property while enabling housing development slightly more dense than the standard. The spit of land between Lake Lucy and Lake Ann, known to Betty and Pete Parks as the Point, is still wooded, and we can compare this growth to what the Dakota people experienced during the founding of Minnesota. Part of the Lake Ann shoreline is owned privately, and thus the city cannot complete a pedestrian and bike path all around its entire circumference. If you look across Lake Lucy today, you will note a panorama not unlike that of the past centuries.